They say every miracle starts with a deadline, and for America, that deadline came in 1961, when President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and basically said, "We're going to the moon before the decade is out, because why not?" It was one of those sentences that sounded heroic in the moment and terrifying the next day. The engineers at NASA probably watched that speech, looked at each other and thought, "He said what now?" At that point, the US had launched exactly one man into space and for about 15 minutes. The Soviets, meanwhile, had already put Yuri Gagarin into orbit, made him a global superstar, and probably given him a medal shaped like a hammer smashing an American calculator. So when Kennedy made that promise, it was less a confident declaration and more a cosmic dare. But it worked. Nothing motivates a country quite like being told they're losing a race they didn't realize they were in. NASA at the time was young, barely 3 years old. Its offices were scattered, its budgets uncertain, and its computers about as advanced as a pocket calculator that runs on hamsters. But suddenly, it had a mission that sounded impossible enough to be irresistible. The moon. How hard could it be? Answer: very. Before anyone could even think about landing there, they had to figure out the basics. Like, for instance, how to leave Earth without exploding. That was the goal of Project Mercury, the first step in America's long, clumsy waltz toward the stars. The Mercury astronauts were called the Original Seven, and they looked like a cross between fighter pilots and toothpaste models. They were selected not just for bravery and skill, but also for their ability to look heroic, while sweating profusely inside a tin can the size of a phone booth. Mercury was about proving humans could survive in space at all. Could we breathe? Could we eat? Could we not freak out while orbiting the planet in a glorified soda can? The answers turned out to be yes, yes, and mostly. John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth in 1962, circling 3 times while the nation held its breath. When he splashed down safely, Kennedy's moon dream suddenly didn't sound so crazy. Mercury taught NASA how to get to space. The next program, Gemini, taught them how to stay there and do things that would one day be crucial for the moon landing. Spacewalking, docking 2 spacecraft together, and figuring out how not to pass out when your blood rushes to your head. In zero gravity, Gemini was also when astronauts learned a vital truth. Space smells weird. They described it as metallic, like burnt gunpowder, a scent you definitely don't want in your home or your helmet. But Gemini worked. And each success made that distant moon a little closer, a little more believable. By the mid-1960s, America was finally catching up to the Soviets. Rockets were growing bigger, faster, and significantly more terrifying to stand near. And yet, just as everything seemed on track, tragedy struck. It was 1967. The Apollo program had just begun, and NASA was testing its first spacecraft on the launch pad. The mission was called Apollo 1. It was supposed to be routine, a plugs-out test, meaning the rocket wasn't even going to leave the ground. But during the test, a spark ignited inside the cabin, filled with pure oxygen. In an instant, fire consumed everything. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were trapped inside. They had no way to open the hatch. All 3 were lost. The nation was stunned. NASA, that shiny symbol of progress, was suddenly faced with the unthinkable. Their dream had killed 3 of their best. For a while, everything stopped. The country mourned. The engineers rethought everything, from the materials in the cabin to the switches on the console, to the bolts on the door. It was a painful lesson, but one that changed spaceflight forever. NASA rebuilt the Apollo spacecraft from the inside out, stronger, smarter, safer. And in a strange way, the loss of Apollo 1 made the success of Apollo 11 possible. It gave the program humility, the kind that comes only when you understand how much you have to lose. By 1968, NASA was ready to fly again. Apollo 7 proved the new spacecraft worked. Apollo 8 did something unthinkable. It left Earth's orbit, flew all the way to the moon and circled it on Christmas Eve. It was the first time humans had ever left home. And while orbiting that cold, silent world, the astronauts turned their camera back toward Earth and took a picture that changed everything, a tiny blue and white marble, floating in the blackness of space. It was called Earthrise. That single photograph did something no speech ever could. It showed us how small and beautiful our world really was. It reminded everyone that we were all riding the same fragile ball through the void, and that maybe, just maybe, we should take better care of it. Apollo 9 and 10 came next, rehearsals for the landing itself. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth's orbit. Apollo 10 took it all the way to the moon, descended to within 50,000 feet of the surface, and then, like a kid peeking into a cookie jar, stopped just short. They called it the dress rehearsal. Everything worked. The next time they'd go all the way. By the summer of 1969, the stage was set. The rockets were ready. The computers were humming. The astronauts had practiced every move so many times they could do it in their sleep, and probably did. And yet, for all the preparation, no one really knew if it would work. There were still 1,000 ways to fail, 1,000 little things that could go wrong. But NASA had a secret weapon, pure, reckless optimism. The same kind of optimism that builds airplanes out of wood, invents electricity on a dare, and sends 3 humans into space with the confidence of someone who definitely did not test this on live television first. As the Apollo 11 rocket, the mighty Saturn V, was rolled out to the launch pad, people lined up for miles just to see it. It was taller than the Statue of Liberty, heavier than an aircraft carrier, and loud enough to rearrange your internal organs if you stood too close. And yet, for all its size, the astronauts' living space at the top was smaller than a minivan. Humanity's first trip to another world would happen in a vehicle roughly the size of your garage, perched on top of a controlled explosion. It was madness, beautiful, calculated madness. On the morning of July 16, 1969, the world watched as the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The engines ignited, flames roared, and the Saturn V lifted off, slow and dignified, as if unsure whether it really wanted to do this. For 2.5 minutes, it climbed through the blue sky, shedding pieces of itself as it went, each stage falling away like old fears being left behind. And when the final booster separated, and the spacecraft slipped into the blackness of space, America finally exhaled. They were on their way. 3 men, 250,000 miles to go, and no backup plan. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins were officially off the Earth, on a journey that would end in either eternal glory or an extremely awkward press conference. The radio crackled, the computers whirred, and somewhere in Houston, an engineer with a coffee cup whispered, "Godspeed, Apollo 11. And with that, the night America went to the moon had quietly begun its countdown. The moon was full that night, big, bright, and impossibly smug. It had been hanging there for billions of years, watching Earth invent fire, build pyramids, and argue about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. And finally, on July 20th, 1969, the moon was about to get visitors. Not gods, not aliens, not even particularly well-rested people. Just 3 humans in matching outfits running on adrenaline, tang, and national pride. If you had been alive that night, and if you were awake and if your TV was cooperating, you'd have seen a picture so grainy it looked like a snowstorm auditioning for the Twilight Zone. But behind that blur was something astonishing. After millions of years of staring up at the moon and wondering for the first time, the moon was staring back. Now, people like to imagine the moon landing as this moment of calm heroism, but behind the scenes, it was chaos in slow motion. The astronauts were sweating through their suits. Mission Control was doing math faster than caffeine should legally allow, and the guidance computer, that tiny box of blinking lights, was throwing error messages like a toddler in a tantrum. In fact, during the descent, the computer flashed a warning, 1202 alarm. Nobody knew what it meant. Was it bad? Was it catastrophic? Was it maybe just a reminder to drink water? Turns out it was an overflow error. Basically, the computer was saying, "Hey, I'm busy, stop asking me so many questions." But since no one had time to argue with a computer mid-landing, Armstrong decided to keep going anyway. Because that's the kind of confidence you get when you've spent your life flying experimental aircraft for fun. As the lunar module, Eagle, descended, Armstrong looked out the tiny window and realized something alarming. The spot they were supposed to land on was filled with boulders the size of Volkswagens. NASA's plan had been perfect, except for the part where the moon didn't cooperate. So Armstrong took manual control. He started flying the lander sideways, skimming over the surface, searching for a safe patch of ground. Buzz Aldrin read, "Out numbers like a man calling bingo at the end of the world. 30 seconds of fuel left." And somewhere in Houston, an engineer probably whispered, "I should have gone into accounting." Finally, at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, Armstrong's calm voice came through the radio. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." For a moment, the world stopped. Kids stopped fidgeting. Reporters stopped typing. Even the moon seemed to take a polite breath. Then came the cheering. Mission Control exploded into applause and tears, the kind of pure joy you only see when you realize 100,000 calculations actually worked. Across America, the celebration was quiet, but deep. People didn't dance in the streets, and they just watched wide-eyed as the impossible turned real. In living rooms from California to Maine, you could hear the faint hum of air conditioners and the soft clink of ice in glasses, as if the whole nation was toasting the sky. Some people prayed, some just stared, and some, probably the smart ones, went to make another pot of coffee. But while Earth celebrated, the astronauts still had work to do. Armstrong and Aldrin began preparing for their moonwalk, while Michael Collins, orbiting alone in the command module, became arguably the loneliest man in the universe. Think about it. He was 60 miles above the moon, completely cut off from radio. Contact every time he passed behind it. For 48 minutes at a time, he was truly, and I mean truly, alone. No messages, no signals, no memes, no Spotify. Just him, a tin can of switches, and the faint hum of life support. And when he looked out his window, he could see two things: the cold, gray desert below and a tiny blue marble in the distance. Earth. Every person he had ever known or loved was on that marble. And for those few quiet minutes, Michael Collins was literally the only human being not on Earth. That's not loneliness. That's poetry in a space helmet. Down on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin ran through their checklist: suits pressurized, systems nominal, flag ready, camera rolling, and nerves. Somewhere between excited and existential. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time, Armstrong opened the hatch and began his descent. Every step echoed through the radio, each metallic clang a countdown to history. And then, that moment, that famous line, the one you've heard 1,000 times but never really listened to. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. He wasn't performing. He wasn't making a speech. He was just narrating. A tired engineer doing what engineers do, describing what's happening. And yet somehow it became the most poetic line ever delivered on live television. Buzz Aldrin followed soon after, and his first words were slightly less quotable. He looked around and said, "Beautiful view. Magnificent desolation," which, if you think about it, sounds like every Airbnb review ever written. The two astronauts bounced lightly across the surface, testing their movements like kids trying to walk on a trampoline for the first time. They planted the flag, carefully angled so it looked dramatic on camera, and collected rocks, which, by the way, they described as gray, about 47 times. Apparently, the moon is not known for its color palette. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the world was still awake. Some watched from bars, some from school gymnasiums, some from the hoods of parked cars under starry skies. Even the Soviet Union, America's great rival, sent a rare message of congratulations. Because in that moment, the space race wasn't about politics anymore. It was about perspective. Humanity had finally touched another world. And for a fleeting instant, every person, from the hippies in San Francisco to the farmers in Kansas, to the engineers in Houston, looked up and thought the same thing. We did it. Of course, not everyone believed it. Even back then, there were whispers. People claiming it was a hoax, filmed in a Hollywood basement with Kubrick behind the camera. NASA ignored them because, frankly, they were too busy making sure the astronauts got home alive. But it's funny how disbelief works. When something is too beautiful, too extraordinary, our first instinct is to say, that can't be real. Maybe that's just our brains protecting us from wonder. By the time Armstrong and Aldrin finished their moonwalk, they had spent just over 2.5 hours outside the lunar module. They collected rocks, set up experiments, and took a photo of Armstrong's boot print, which would outlast every human monument ever built. Then they climbed back into the Eagle, sealed the hatch, and prepared to rest. They were supposed to sleep on the moon, but neither of them could. It wasn't fear, it wasn't excitement. It was just impossible to sleep when you've just done the most astonishing thing in human history and there's lunar dust in your socks. And so, while they floated in that tiny capsule, and while Collins drifted silently above them, and while billions of people around the world turned off their TVs and finally closed their eyes, the moon hung above, quiet and pale, with two new footprints glinting in the dust. The night was over. The dream had been real, and somewhere on Earth someone whispered before drifting off, "We actually did it." The launch was over. The shaking stopped. And then, for the first time in their lives, the three men inside Apollo 11 experienced absolute silence. Not quiet, silence. No rumbling engines, no wind, no gravity tugging at their bones. Just the hum of the spacecraft and the sound of their own breathing inside helmets that smelled faintly of metal, plastic, and nerves. The view out the window was everything and nothing at once, a blackness so deep it almost had texture, pierced by a single glowing crescent of blue earth shrinking behind them. If you've ever been homesick, imagine that feeling. And multiply it by 240,000 miles. They were now traveling at roughly 24,000 miles per hour. That's 7 miles per second. Or, if you prefer, way too fast to change your mind. The command module, named Columbia, was home for the next 8 days. It was about the size of a small camper van, with no privacy, limited snacks, and a bathroom that functioned mostly on faith. Inside were Neil Armstrong, the engineer with the calmest voice in human history; Buzz Aldrin, the energetic fighter, pilot who loved checklists; and Michael Collins, the quiet workhorse who would orbit the moon alone later. The cosmic third wheel of destiny. They didn't have much to do in those first few hours except settle in and marvel at the fact that everything had gone according to plan. No fires, no explosions, no missing bolts. Just 3 guys in a metal cone, now officially homeless from Earth. Armstrong took out a camera and started filming. Buzz checked systems. Collins, ever the practical one, opened a meal packet and tried to make dinner, which mostly involved squeezing toothpaste tubes filled with what NASA optimistically called beef stew. The food was strange, but edible. The coffee came in frozen cubes you added hot water to. The desserts were compacted enough to break small bones if dropped. It wasn't exactly room service, but compared to the menu on the Titanic, it was fine dining. Weightlessness hit them like a trick. Everything floated. Pens, crumbs, socks, opinions. When Armstrong took off his gloves, they drifted away, and he spent 10 minutes chasing them like a man trying to wrangle 2 sleepy birds. Buzz, ever the problem solver, used his feet to hold himself steady and wrote in his logbook upside down, which he later said was oddly relaxing. And Collins, who had the driest sense of humor of them all, noted in his report, "Space is peaceful. Nobody can yell at you here." The journey took about 3 days. 3 long, floating, slightly claustrophobic days. Every few hours, mission control checked in. Telemetry was normal. Oxygen levels were fine. And every time, Houston's voice sounded just a bit too cheerful. like parents trying to sound calm, while their kids borrow the car for the first time. During one of those check-ins, Collins quipped, "Everything's A-OK up here, but if you find my watch, I think it's floating toward the moon ahead of us." Mission Control laughed. It was the first joke told between worlds. On day 2, they passed what NASA called the translunar midpoint. That's the halfway mark between Earth and the moon. The moment gravity flips when the pull of the moon becomes stronger than Earth's. From that point on, they were officially falling toward the moon. Not steering toward it. Falling. It's weird to think about, that the most sophisticated machine ever built was, at that point, just an elaborate fall. Humanity's most daring journey, powered mostly by physics and faith. Back home, people kept watching. TV stations ran updates every few hours. News anchors spoke in that formal 1960s cadence, calling the astronauts the 3 brave men on their way to destiny, while showing diagrams that looked suspiciously like salt shakers labeled Command Module. Kids cut out newspaper clippings and taped them to their walls. Adults argued about whether it was worth the money. And somewhere in Florida, a group of engineers who hadn't slept in 4 days drank bad coffee and triple-checked every line of code they'd ever written. That code, by the way, was written by hand, often by women at MIT who used punch cards, slide rules, and a level of patience that deserves its own monument. The lead software engineer, Margaret Hamilton, once brought her daughter to work, who accidentally ran a test that crashed the simulator. That crash revealed a critical bug that, if left unfixed, would have doomed the moon landing. So technically, the Apollo program was partially saved by a bored child, which feels, somehow, very American. Inside the spacecraft, Armstrong wrote small notes to himself. He was meticulous, thoughtful, always checking and rechecking his math. Aldrin, more animated, took pictures of everything, including the moon, which grew larger every hour like a pale coin spinning in the dark. And Collins, methodical as ever, took joy in simple things. Organizing the cabin, cleaning up floating crumbs, and occasionally muttering, "I really hope these bolts were tightened properly." At one point, they turned the spacecraft around, so the engine faced forward, a maneuver called mid-course correction. Armstrong executed it with surgical precision, aligning the stars outside with markings on the window. They fired the engine for a few seconds to adjust their trajectory. It was quiet, perfect, almost eerie, and then it was over. 3 days into the journey, the moon filled the windows, gray, cratered, mysterious. Every detail crisp and cold under the sunlight that had no air to soften it. They were entering lunar orbit, the first humans to arrive. Since, well, ever. They fired the engine again to slow down, a burn that had to be timed to the second. If they fired too long, they'd crash. Too short, and they'd skip off the moon's gravity like a stone across a pond, drifting into the void forever, which is the kind of mistake you only get to make once. But it worked. When the engine cut off, they were circling the moon, and the first words from Armstrong weren't poetic. They were calm engineer words. We're in lunar orbit. Below them stretched a landscape that looked like the world's most ambitious parking lot. Gray, pitted, endless. The craters went on forever, each one a silent scar from billions of years of collisions. There were no colors, no air, no sound. Just shadow and sunlight fighting for the same ground. The astronauts stared in silence. Aldrin muttered that it looked like powdered charcoal. Collins, ever practical, noted that if you squinted, it almost resembled a desert back home. Except, without the convenience of atmosphere. For 2 hours, they orbited and checked systems. They photographed landmarks with names like Sea of Tranquility and Ocean of Storms, which sounded poetic until you realized they were just enormous plains of dust. And then it was time. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, Eagle. It was tiny, fragile, a metal spider held together by bolts, wires, and faith. Collins stayed in orbit, running checklists, pretending not to worry. He watched as the Eagle detached, a slow, drifting motion that made it look like 2 old friends saying goodbye. Down below, Houston's voice crackled through static. Telemetry nominal. Guidance aligned. They were descending. Imagine that moment. You've traveled 250,000 miles, spent years preparing, and now you're falling toward an alien surface with nothing but a glorified calculator guiding. At 50,000 feet above the surface, the Eagle's radar locked onto the ground. Everything was going smoothly. Then came the alarms. Program alarm 1202. Armstrong didn't panic. He asked calmly, "Give us a reading on that program alarm." Back in Houston, engineers scrambled. One of them, a man named Steve Bales, quickly identified it. The computer was overloaded. Too many tasks running at once. But it was still functioning. He gave the go-ahead. Your go. It's hard to overstate how wild that moment was. At that altitude, they had maybe 6 minutes of fuel left. Every decision counted. Armstrong took manual control, steering, away from the boulder field below, searching for flat ground. The moon's surface drifted closer, rising to meet them. Fuel, 60 seconds, then 30. Aldrin called out numbers in a voice that was steady but tight. Armstrong's hand stayed on the ice gut stick, calm as ever. The Eagle floated down, kicking up dust, vanishing into its own shadow. And then, with a soft bump and a crackling transmission, came the words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In Houston, chaos, cheering, clapping, tears, relief. As if every breath the planet had been holding for 8 years was finally released. But up there, inside that little module, it was just quiet again. Two men looking out at a landscape that had never known footprints, listening to the faint hum of their life support systems, trying to comprehend what they'd just done. They were 240,000 miles from home, and somehow, perfectly on target. For a few moments after the landing, no one spoke. Armstrong and Aldrin just sat there, listening to the soft clicks of the cooling metal around them. It was over. Or rather, the first part was. They'd made it to the moon. They were supposed to rest now, take a nap before the next step. But it turns out it's hard to sleep when you've just parked on another celestial body. Imagine it. You're sitting in a glorified soda can on a world where no human has ever been, and NASA is telling you, "Okay, get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." Sure, right after I finish processing the fact that I'm currently on the moon, after some polite discussion. And by discussion, I mean Armstrong saying something calm like, "We're not tired," and Houston saying, "That's fine." They began preparations for the first moonwalk. The suits were cumbersome, like dressing. For a snowstorm inside a phone booth, they had to manage oxygen, cooling, and communications, all in a shell of nylon, aluminum, and Teflon, which, incidentally, is the same material used in frying pans. So yes, technically, the astronauts were wrapped in non-stick armor. As Armstrong depressurized the cabin, the hiss of air escaping filled the module like a sigh from the universe itself. Then came the words everyone knew would one day be history. "I'm going to step off the LM now," one step down the ladder. A boot pressing gently into gray dust finer than talcum powder. And then the sentence that would echo forever. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He flubbed the line slightly. He was supposed to say "one small step for a man," but really, who's going to correct him? You step onto the moon, you earn the right to edit grammar. In real time, he looked around, taking it all in. The horizon was only a few miles away, curved and alien, under a black sky where the earth hung like a marble of blue glass. There was no wind, no sound. Even his footsteps made no noise. Only a puff of dust that drifted lazily back to the surface as if gravity itself were too tired to hurry. Aldrin followed a few minutes later. He stepped off, bounced once, and said something that was accidentally perfect. "Beautiful view. Magnificent desolation." That phrase would stick. Poetic, bleak, and utterly accurate. Because the moon was beautiful, yes, but also lonely. A world untouched, unchanging, and frankly in desperate need of landscaping. Together, they moved carefully around the landing site, testing how it felt to walk in 1/6 gravity. It was awkward, more like hopping than walking. If you've ever tried running in a pool, you're halfway there, minus the water, and with 240,000 miles of anxiety added. NASA's instructions were clear. Don't fall over, don't break anything, and whatever you do, don't trip on live TV. They managed all three admirably. They planted the American flag, which wasn't easy. The pole wouldn't go deep into the hard lunar soil, so Armstrong and Aldrin had to wiggle it back and forth like two men trying to pitch a tent on concrete. Finally, they got it upright, just in time for it to lean slightly in the low gravity, giving it a charming homemade look. Buzz saluted it. Armstrong took the photo, and somewhere in Houston someone probably whispered, "Straighten it a bit more," even though it was far too late. They also set up a small plaque on the landing leg which read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind," which was technically true. Though back on Earth, the Cold War still had about 20 more years of not being very peaceful. Then came the experiments. A seismometer to measure moonquakes. A retroreflector that would allow lasers from Earth to measure the distance precisely. And of course, the collection of lunar samples, otherwise known as rocks that will immediately become priceless. Armstrong gathered them methodically, placing them in bags that looked suspiciously like lunch sacks. He once described the surface material as like powdered charcoal, and by the end of the mission, both astronauts were covered in it. The dust clung to everything: suits, gloves, boots. When they got back inside, it smelled strange, like burnt gunpowder and static electricity. Buzz later said it was the smell of the moon itself, which is possibly the least helpful product description in history. Back home, people were transfixed. Every TV in America was tuned in. Bars were silent. Churches were open late, some holding watch parties, as if waiting for a divine update. And somewhere in New York, a man yelled out his window, "Hey, look, they did it," as if the moon might answer back. The broadcast was ghostly, black and white, shaky, faint. Yet somehow that grainy image had more power than any high-definition spectacle since. It wasn't just a picture. It was proof that humanity could reach beyond itself. For 2.5 hours they explored. They took pictures, made observations, and occasionally cracked small jokes that NASA, for reasons of dignity, did not broadcast. Aldrin described how it felt to bounce around. Armstrong, ever the engineer, kept notes like, "Boots penetrate 1-2 inch into surface," which sounds dry until you remember he was describing the literal ground of another world. Before re-entering the lunar module, they placed a small package of mementos. Mission patches from Apollo 1, honoring the astronauts who died in the fire, and a small golden olive branch, a symbol of peace. They also left behind a silicon disc etched with messages from leaders around the world. It was humanity's first time littering on another planet, but in a classy way. When it was time to head back inside, they climbed up the ladder slowly, taking one last look at the barren plain below. Their footprints stretched out like tiny punctuation marks in an endless sentence. Armstrong paused at the hatch and said softly, "Good night, good luck." No one heard it on the live feed, but Aldrin would later confirm it. Once inside, they sealed the hatch and repressurized the cabin. The silence that followed was heavier than gravity. They had done it. They were the first humans to walk on another world, and now they just needed to find a way home. They removed their helmets and gloves, rubbed their eyes, and laughed. Lunar dust floated in the air like glitter at a very expensive construction site. Buzz took communion quietly, a personal ritual he'd prepared for the moment. Armstrong wrote a few notes, methodical as always, and then they tried, unsuccessfully, to sleep. Outside, the moon was unbothered. The flag stood still in the vacuum. Their footprints remained undisturbed, perfectly preserved in the dust. There was no wind to erase them, no rain to wash them away. They'd be there for millions of years, maybe forever. Two sets of prints leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Meanwhile, Collins was orbiting above, completely alone. Each time he passed over the far side of the moon, radio contact vanished. For 48 minutes at a time, he was out of reach of every other human being. He later said he didn't feel lonely, just peaceful. He looked down and imagined his two crewmates as small specks on that gray surface. And then he looked up, at Earth, a glowing marble hanging in the black, and realized he was seeing all of human history in a single glance. It was a perspective no poet, no philosopher, no mystic had ever truly known before. Just a pilot drifting alone, keeping watch over two friends below and a world above. After their brief, sleepless rest, Armstrong and Aldrin began preparing for liftoff. The next step was the one no one talked about much: leaving the moon. Landing was heroic. Leaving was terrifying, because if that ascent engine didn't ignite, they'd stay there, forever. There was no rescue mission, no backup ship, just them, a button, and the hope that every circuit and wire was doing its job. They, suited up again, checked the systems and prepared to launch. Armstrong flipped the switch. A tiny spark ignited. And then, a gentle thump, a roar, and the Eagle began to rise. From the surface below, the flag fluttered briefly in the exhaust and then stood still again. The lander's ascent stage shot upward, leaving behind the descent stage, a small monument to human audacity. In orbit, Collins watched the tiny spark rise to meet him. "Beautiful," he said quietly. And when they docked, the three men were together again. They had done it. Landed, walked, left, survived. And yet the hardest part was still ahead, getting home. The moon was getting smaller now, or rather, they were getting farther away. Either way, the view was the same. A silver coin shrinking into black velvet, while a bright blue marble grew ahead. Earth, home, everything they'd ever known. Slowly getting bigger with every second. After the lunar ascent and the docking, they transferred the rocks, the film, and the little mementos back into the command module, Columbia. Then they sealed off the Eagle, undocked, and let it drift away. It would crash onto the moon a few hours later, ending its brief, glorious career as humanity's most successful metal insect. "Goodbye, Eagle," Collins said quietly as they watched it drift off. It wasn't in the script, but everyone agreed. It was the right thing to say. The moon faded behind them. The stars didn't twinkle here, and they just stared back, constant and cold. Now came the long trip home. 3 days of drifting through emptiness again. 3 days of the hum of machinery, the sound of breathing, and the occasional polite argument over who had eaten the last freeze-dried peaches. NASA's plan was simple, though it sounded like a dare to gravity. Fire the engine one last time, aim precisely for a narrow corridor through Earth's atmosphere, and hope the physics worked as advertised. Too shallow, and they'd bounce off into space. Too steep, and they'd burn up on entry. It was the celestial equivalent of throwing a dart from the moon and trying to hit a moving target on Earth, while blindfolded, spinning, and traveling faster than a rifle bullet. In other words, just another day for NASA. Collins was still busy with checklists, his natural habitat. Aldrin checked instruments. Armstrong took one last look through the window at the distant moon and said softly, "It's a beautiful place. I'm glad we went." No fanfare, no speech, just that, which is why he was the perfect person for the job. They spent hours reviewing re-entry procedures. Oxygen levels, fuel reserves, cabin pressure, all nominal. But everyone knew what the next few minutes would bring. A violent, fiery plunge into the atmosphere, followed by a long silence as the radio blacked out. Back on Earth, people gathered, again around TVs and radios, the same way they had for launch and landing and every other milestone in between. But this time it was different. The excitement had been replaced by something quieter, a shared anxiety, like waiting for a phone call from someone you love who's traveling through a storm. At 11:35 a.m. on July 24, 1969, the command module fired its engine for the final time. The moon was now behind them, Earth ahead. The velocity, 36,000 feet per second, roughly Mach 33. And then the blue glow of atmosphere. Re-entry. The capsule hit the upper atmosphere like a stone skipping across water. Except this stone was glowing orange. The temperature outside rose to nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal, hot enough to remind everyone that space travel is basically controlled falling with style. Inside, the astronauts felt the G-forces press down, their bodies pulled into the seats, faces tight against invisible hands. The heat shield sizzled, vaporizing layer by layer. The only thing standing between them and a bad day. Then came the blackout. 3 minutes with no radio contact. 3 minutes when mission control could do nothing but stare at monitors and breathe. 3 minutes when the entire world waited. And then, a crackle. Columbia, Houston, we read you. The capsule was intact. They were alive, and the world exhaled in unison. The parachutes opened. 1, 2, 3. Brilliant orange and white against the sky, blooming like flowers after fire. Below them stretched the Pacific Ocean, calm and endless. The splashdown came at 12:50 p.m., 812 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii. A perfect landing, as if the ocean had been waiting. The first words out of the capsule were calm, as always. Everything's okay. We're in good shape, which translated from astronaut speak means, please send coffee. Helicopters appeared on the horizon, circling the capsule like excited dragonflies. The recovery ship, the USS Hornet, was nearby, its deck crowded, with sailors and scientists waiting for the heroes of the century to come home. There was, however, one small complication. NASA wasn't entirely sure whether the moon was carrying any microscopic hitchhikers. You know, space germs. So, just in case, they'd decided the astronauts should be quarantined for a while. Nothing says, welcome back, heroes, quite like immediately locking you in a metal box. As the recovery divers reached the capsule, they handed the astronauts biological isolation suits, white, baggy outfits that made them look like astronauts twice removed. They were hoisted up to the helicopter, flown to the Hornet, and greeted by none other than President Richard Nixon, who smiled through the glass of their quarantine trailer and said, "Great job, gentlemen." Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins waved back politely, smiling as though this were the most normal interaction imaginable. Nixon, to his credit, didn't seem to mind the fact that the most historic handshake of the century happened through a window. The astronauts stayed in quarantine for 21 days, eating, exercising, and answering questions from scientists about how they felt, whether they'd seen anything odd, and occasionally whether they glowed in the dark. They didn't. Though Aldrin once joked, "If we start sprouting antennas, we'll let you know." Meanwhile, their moon rocks were being examined in Houston. Geologists were thrilled. The samples contained tiny glass beads formed by ancient volcanoes and minerals that suggested the moon had once been molten. Proof that it wasn't just a dead rock, but a world with a violent past. Every scientist wanted a piece of the moon, metaphorically and sometimes literally. One researcher at a museum reportedly said, "It's the only time in my career I've handled something older than time itself." While the rocks told their story, the astronauts told theirs. They did interviews, press conferences, parades. They smiled, saluted, shook hands, and posed for endless photos. Armstrong especially seemed a little uncomfortable with all the attention. He once said, "I was just the tip of the arrow. Thousands of people built the bow." Which is the sort of thing only a man who's walked on the moon can say without sounding smug. Buzz, meanwhile, embraced the spotlight with his usual mix of enthusiasm and precision. Collins preferred to stay in the background, happy to let the others speak while he quietly went about the business of being the only person in history to orbit the moon alone and come back sane. When they finally stepped out of quarantine, they were greeted like returning gods. Crowds lined the streets for miles, waving flags and holding up signs that said things like, "Welcome home, Moon's men," and "We missed you, Buzz." And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, Armstrong smiled and said something characteristically understated. "It's good to be back on Earth." And that was that. 8 years after Kennedy's impossible promise, America had done it. The space race was over. The moon had been reached, touched, and left. And humanity, for a moment, had looked up together and realized it was capable of anything. Of course, in true human fashion, the moment didn't last forever. Politics resumed. Budgets were cut. People went back to worrying about grocery prices, elections, and baseball. The astronauts became mortals again. And the moon, well, it went back to being the moon. But for those who were alive that July night, the memory lingered. The sight of that ghostly image on the TV screen. The sound of Armstrong's calm voice. The sudden awareness that we'd stepped out of our cradle and touched something eternal. It wasn't just science. It was poetry, written in dust. And though the footprints may never fade, the real legacy was invisible. A collective understanding that the impossible was sometimes only a few calculations away. The parades ended. The cameras turned off. And the men who had gone to the moon were suddenly back. Back on Earth. Back to gravity and traffic and small talk about the weather. There's something faintly absurd about being asked, "So how was your trip?" when your trip included a stop on another world. The Apollo 11 astronauts were national treasures, of course. But they were also men trying to find their way home again in a world that suddenly seemed smaller than before. Neil Armstrong returned. Quietly to his farm in Ohio. He taught engineering, gave the occasional lecture, and tried with admirable patience to deflect every person who asked him to autograph a rock. He avoided the spotlight the way some people avoid second helpings of dessert, politely but firmly. When reporters came calling, he'd talk about aerodynamics, mathematics, safety margins. Never the mysticism people expected. They wanted poetry. He offered precision. But in his own way, that was poetry too. He once said, "I don't see myself as a hero. I see myself as a lucky engineer." And maybe that was truer than anyone realized. Buzz Aldrin took a different path. He was loud, charismatic, honest, and occasionally chaotic, which, if we're being fair, makes him sound a bit like America itself. He struggled in the years after Apollo. Fame is a strange gravity of its own. And Buzz found himself orbiting its pull, drifting between speaking tours, failed marriages, and bouts of depression. He was candid about it, though. He turned his battles into lessons, and his name, Buzz, became both legend and cartoon character. A strange immortality, but not a bad one. Michael Collins, meanwhile, went to work for the State Department, then became director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. When asked if he regretted not walking on the moon, he said, "No, I was part of something wonderful." And that really is the perfect summary of his soul. Quiet joy without envy. For a while, the world kept looking up. Apollo 12 landed. Then 14, 15, 16, 17. Each mission was smoother, more scientific, less theatrical. By 1972, we'd sent 12 men to the moon. And then just like that, we stopped. The reasons were familiar: money, politics, public boredom. Once you've done the impossible, it somehow becomes less exciting the second time. NASA moved on. To space stations, to reusable shuttles, to robots with better work ethics than humans. But the moon, that pale companion that had watched over every generation, became once again a thing we admired from afar. Children still drew it in crayon. Lovers still blamed it for their mood swings. Poets still wrote about it. But no one touched it again. And so, the night America went to the moon slowly became a memory, and then a myth. People started asking the kinds of questions myths invite. Why did we go? Was it worth it? What did it mean? Some said it was about competition, a flex in the Cold War, a technological high five meant to show the world who could reach higher. And sure, that's part of it. But it's not the whole story, because even in the most pragmatic engineers, there was still wonder. Still a spark that said, "We go because we can." NASA's motto could have been that. Not about conquest, not about glory, just quiet curiosity with a dash of audacity. And maybe that's what makes Apollo 11 so strangely comforting to remember. It wasn't war. It wasn't greed. It was, in its purest form, a collective moment of why not. Of course, the myths grew. Conspiracies crept in. Some people insisting it had all been filmed on a Hollywood soundstage. Armstrong once said, "It would have been harder to fake it." He wasn't wrong. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and pilots would have had to lie. And none of them were paid enough for that level of acting. But the conspiracies never really diminished the achievement. If anything, they confirmed how unbelievable the truth still feels. That humans, fragile, emotional, oxygen-dependent creatures, actually left the cradle of their planet, walked on another world, and came back to tell the tale. That's the part that still catches in the throat. Not the flag, not the glory, but the audacity of leaving, and the tenderness of coming home. In time, Apollo became nostalgia, a flickering black and white dream. The space program changed, computers shrank, phones got smarter than the entire Apollo guidance computer, which, for the record, had less processing power than a modern digital watch. Armstrong once held an iPhone and said, "This thing has more memory than all of NASA when I flew." He wasn't joking. Meanwhile, new generations grew up under the same moon. But for them, it was history, not adventure. A bedtime story told by tired dreamers, like the one you're hearing now. Still, every so often the world looks up again. A new rocket launches. A rover lands on Mars. Someone whispers, "Maybe we'll go back." And the moon just waits, silent and patient, like an old friend who knows you'll return eventually. Sometimes I wonder what Armstrong must have thought, standing there that night, the whole world listening, and realizing that for all the glory and all the science, the most profound thing was probably the view. Looking back at Earth, a tiny, fragile sphere hanging in blackness, and realizing that everyone you've ever known, every book, every song, every war, every child, every heartbreak, all fit into that glowing marble. Maybe that's the real story of Apollo 11. Not that we went to the moon, but that we saw Earth clearly for the first time. For a brief moment, humanity had perspective. And then, as always, we went back to arguing about parking spots. But it's still there, that clarity. You can feel it on clear nights, when the air is still and the moon hangs low and full. It's a reminder of what's possible when we stop doubting, stop fighting, and start building something absurdly hopeful. Because the night America went to the moon wasn't just a night. It was a mirror held up to everything we are. Brilliant, flawed, scared, brave, ridiculous, unstoppable. Armstrong died in 2012. Aldrin's still alive, still talking about Mars, still reminding anyone who'll listen that we're not done yet. Collins passed quietly in 2021. He'd often said that when he looked at Earth from orbit, what struck him most wasn't the continents or the clouds. It was the lack of borders. And if that's not the most quietly profound observation of the 20th century, I don't know what is. The footprints are still there. No wind to erase them. No rain to soften their edges. A silent record of the night humanity proved it could do something magnificent, then quietly went home for dinner. If aliens ever visit and stumble across them, I like to imagine they'll pause, tilt their heads, and say, "Well, someone had ambition," and then they'll move on because even in the cosmic sense, we're just another species trying to make our mark before bedtime. It's strange what happens to a dream once it comes true. It doesn't vanish exactly. It changes shape. It becomes memory, story, wallpaper for the future. After Apollo 11, the moon landing seeped into culture like moonlight through curtains. It was everywhere. In songs, cereal boxes, comic books, car commercials. Space age became shorthand for anything shiny, hopeful, and slightly over-designed. A blender could be space age, so could a haircut. For a few years, everyone wanted to look like they were ready for launch. Television got in on it too. There were space sitcoms, space operas, space westerns, even space pets, Lassie, but with a helmet. If you were alive in the early 70s, you couldn't throw a moon rock without hitting something that glowed in phosphorescent optimism. But optimism has a short half-life. Soon came Vietnam, Watergate, energy crises, and the general human tendency to forget what made them hopeful in the first place. By the time Apollo 17 left the moon, most people had changed the channel. Space was expensive, and Earth once again demanded attention. Still, something lingered. A quiet awe, a strange comfort in knowing we'd been there, that the night sky wasn't unreachable after all. Children born after the moon landing grew up thinking it was normal, that humans could leave Earth whenever they wanted, which is adorable, and not entirely wrong. Writers found new metaphors, painters found new palettes. Every science fiction author suddenly had to work harder, because reality had stolen their best plot twist. Before Apollo, the moon was a symbol of longing. After Apollo, it became proof of potential. And yet, even that proof didn't cure the insomnia of humanity. We still lay awake under the same light, still made wishes, still wondered what else was out there. We just did it, knowing we'd already touched one dream and survived. In art and music, the moon became gentler. David Bowie sang of starmen. Pink Floyd gave us The Dark Side of the Moon, an album about madness and time and the cosmic hum of existing. You can almost hear the lunar dust between the notes. Movies followed. Some made space heroic, some made it lonely, most made it expensive. By the 80s, the moon had gone from scientific frontier to romantic backdrop again. It was where lovers stared, where monsters howled, where E.T. pedaled across the sky. It's funny, isn't it? We went all the way there and still came home to tell fairy tales about it. NASA carried on. Satellites, shuttles, telescopes. The agency quietly turned, its attention outward toward Mars, Jupiter, and the restless galaxies beyond. The moon was old news, but every once in a while, someone in a flight suit would look up from their coffee and say, "You know, we should go back." And everyone would nod thoughtfully, then return to paperwork. The public, meanwhile, drifted further into abstraction. The moon landing became a screensaver for the human psyche, a nice, calming image to recall when the news got too weird. But every so often, something reignited the old spark. A rocket test, a new rover, a kid looking through a telescope and saying, "Someday I'll go there." That's the quiet power of Apollo. It didn't just put men on the moon, it planted an idea in humanity's collective imagination that leaving home isn't the end of comfort, but the beginning of understanding. There's something very sleepy about that idea, like a bedtime story whispered across generations. We tell it to ourselves in different accents and with new technology, but the moral stays the same. We are small, we are curious, and we are capable of ridiculous, wonderful things. Maybe that's why the moon feels like such a soothing companion. At night, it's proof that we once did something brave and impossible, and survived to dream about it afterward. If you ever find yourself awake at 3 a.m., staring out a window and seeing that pale circle hanging in the sky, remember that it's not just reflecting sunlight, it's reflecting memory. All the sleepless engineers, the worried mothers, the kids who pretended their flashlights were rocket boosters, they're all up there in spirit. Their hopes turned into footprints. The Apollo program also changed how we see ourselves. Before, we thought of the world as huge and divided, oceans, borders, tribes. After Apollo, we had photographs showing otherwise. The Earthrise photo, that perfect shot of our planet hanging above the moon's horizon, became the most important portrait in human history. For the first time, we saw ourselves as one fragile marble, alone in the void, with no backup planet, no spare parts. That picture launched the environmental movement. It inspired global cooperation, or at least the occasional attempt. It reminded everyone that Earth was not the center of the universe, just the prettiest neighborhood for a few billion light years. In its own quiet way, the moon landing wasn't about escaping Earth. It was about realizing how lucky we are to have it. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins drifting in orbit, watching that blue glow below them, and feeling the same strange mix of pride and homesickness. They didn't conquer space. They visited it politely, left a few instruments, and promised to call. And somehow that humility made the whole thing even more human. Now, more than 50 years later, the story still puts people to sleep, in the best way. It's a lullaby, disguised as history, a reminder that even when everything feels impossible, someone, somewhere is building a rocket. We look up at the moon and think, wow, they went there. But maybe the real miracle is that they came back. Because returning, safely, sanely, without losing wonder along the way, might be the hardest journey of all. So when you lie in bed tonight, and that silver light sneaks through your blinds, think of 3 men floating home, watching the earth rise larger and larger until it filled their whole window. Think of the hum of the spacecraft, the silence of space, the calm voice saying, "Tranquility base here," and realize that you are made of the same atoms that made the moon, the same stardust that fueled the rockets, the same quiet courage that made someone look up and say, "Let's go." It's a comforting thought, that our greatest adventure began not with certainty, but with curiosity. And maybe that's the secret to sleeping well, knowing that the universe is vast, but we've already proven we can touch it. And so, here we are, half a century later, still turning under that same moon. The rockets have changed, the politics have changed, but the sky looks exactly the same. That's the humbling part, isn't it? You can build a rocket that breaks the sound barrier, invent a computer that fits in your pocket, teach it to show you pictures of cats from space, and the moon will just sit there glowing quietly, as if to say, "That's nice, dear." It's patient, the moon, older than memory, older than the word memory. It's seen every version of us, the cave painters, the farmers, the kings, the astronauts. And on one particular night in 1969, it saw something new, human footprints. For billions of years it was untouched, and then, suddenly, boot prints and a flag and a man saying, in a voice that still echoes through time, "That's one small step for man." It's hard to imagine silence after that, the kind of silence that only space can give you, where every sound has to be carried on wires and breath. Imagine standing there, the world behind you a blue marble in blackness, and realizing that you are, at that moment, the farthest anyone has ever been from home. That's not just history. That's the kind of thought that makes you go still, even 50 years later in your warm bed, listening to this story. Because maybe what keeps us awake at night isn't the noise of the world. It's the wonder of it. The quiet, impossible thought that we are capable of something that grand. The night America went to the moon wasn't really about America. Not in the way the headlines made it sound. It was about what humans can do when curiosity wins. When the voice that says, "It's impossible," is outvoted by the one that says, "But what if?" We built ladders of fire and steel. We rode them into the dark, and we came home with dust on our boots and stories to tell. Stories like this one. Stories that grow gentler every time they're told, until they're less about science and more about serenity. The story of Apollo 11 has a kind of rhythm to it. The countdown, the roar, the silence, the heartbeat, the landing, the pause, the words. Even the sequence feels like a lullaby, as if the whole mission were designed to calm the human race just before sleep. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the moon, not the perfect circle you see on postcards, but the real one. Pitted, rough, ancient. The light there is sharp, not soft. The shadows are so dark they look infinite. But above it all hangs Earth, blue, glowing, alive. That was the view from Tranquility Base. A view that changed humanity without changing a single star. The astronauts said it was quiet up there. No wind, no birds, no ticking clocks. Just the faint hum of machinery and the sound of their own breathing. They said that's what surprised them most, how peaceful it felt. And maybe that's the real secret of space. It isn't about escaping chaos, but discovering calm. That's why this story belongs at bedtime. Because the night America went to the moon isn't just an adventure story. It's a meditation on stillness, on courage that whispers instead of shouts, on the beauty of taking a single, careful step into the unknown. Sometimes I think the Apollo program was the universe's way of tucking us in. It showed us what's out there and reminded us how precious it is in here. Because after you've seen Earth from space, after you've realized how tiny it is, how fragile, how miraculous, you don't look at night the same way again. Every quiet evening, every silver glint on the water, every lazy breeze through trees, it all feels like home in a way that's cosmic. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Coming home. Armstrong's last words before leaving the moon weren't famous. He said something simple to Mission Control about securing equipment, checking valves, ordinary language. But the tone, the calm, almost sleepy professionalism was somehow more moving than the poetry. It was the sound of a man who had gone to another world and was ready for bed. We all know that feeling. After a long day or a long epic, you just want to rest, to close your eyes, to feel gravity again, to dream. So maybe tonight, as you drift, you can think of that moment. The engine's quiet, the capsule gliding through darkness, Earth growing larger in the window. 3 men floating home, tired, relieved and slightly hungry for something that didn't come in a tube. Back on Earth, people were still cheering, still waving flags, still writing headlines. But up there, inside that small capsule, it was peaceful. Almost like sleep. They re-entered the atmosphere, their tiny craft blazing like a shooting star. And for a few minutes, they became streaks of light across the sky. 3 dreamers falling home. When their parachutes opened and the ocean welcomed them back, it felt like the end of a fairy tale. The heroes returned, the quest complete, the kingdom safe. But the truth is, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Because ever since that night, every generation has looked up at the moon and felt a little less small. That's what a good story does. It doesn't just tell you what happened. It reminds you who you are. And who are we, really? If not creatures who dream too big, reach too far, and somehow still make it home in time for breakfast. So, as you lie there, listening to this story fade into quiet, remember, you're part of the same story. The same species that once looked up and decided that the sky was not the limit, but the beginning. The moon is still there, bright and patient, waiting for us to visit again. And maybe someday we will. Maybe someday. Another voice will whisper, "Tranquility Base, we're back." Until then, we dream, we build in our sleep, we travel without moving. We remember that impossible is just a word we haven't outgrown yet. And when the night feels long, when the world feels too heavy, look up and think of that moment in 1969 when humanity floated in darkness, looked back at itself, and smiled. Because that was the night America went to the moon, and the world fell a little quieter, a little braver, a little more at peace. Good night from the moon, and from me, your sleepy dreamer in America.